All right. Good noon, everybody, and welcome back to God Was Here, our study of the life of Christ as recorded in the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We have finally gotten into a spot within the Synoptic Gospels where we can get a better idea of when this stuff is happening. As we'll see through this lesson, Luke still messes with us a little bit, and I might talk about that here a bit. But we're within the end game, shall we call it, for the most part. There's still a couple of things that might have happened earlier, but we're towards the end of this, and by the end of this one, we should be getting into the last week of Jesus' life, if we haven't touched on that already. But it's not going to be like how it's been for most of this, where at some point during his ministry, Jesus did this miracle, and then at some point during his ministry, Jesus taught this thing. It's a little more sure of the timing now. So let's talk about it. We were talking about some of the things Jesus did on his journey to Jerusalem. And I want to cover a couple more here that I think probably happened during his physical journey to Jerusalem. I mentioned that Luke messes with us a little bit, and I'll give you an example of it. Luke 9:51 through 56 is where we're going to be starting. Luke 9:51 through 56. It says, "When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem, and he sent messengers ahead of him, who went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make preparations for him. But the people did not receive him, because his face was set towards Jerusalem. And when his disciples James and John saw it, they said, 'Lord, do you want us to tell fire to come down from heaven and consume them?' But he turned and rebuked them, and they went to another village." Okay. I know this is putting us back in time a little bit because earlier we had Jesus in Jericho. I'll be honest, that was my mistake. But here it says that Jesus, while he had set his face towards Jerusalem, so he's journeying to Jerusalem, he's naturally going through Samaria at that time, and he is rejected by a particular Samaritan village. He's just looking for hospitality. Doesn't seem like it's a particularly big deal, but for whatever reason, because he has set his face towards Jerusalem, they don't want to have anything to do with him. Now, I'm not going to lie to you. I don't know exactly what this means. Why, having set his face towards Jerusalem, presumably that means that he had intended to go to Jerusalem. They didn't want to have anything to do with him. I don't know. I don't really think it's the important part of it. The real important part of this lesson is what happens with James and John. Now, I'm trying not to talk too much about John, because we are trying to focus on the accounts of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and of course John has his own account here, but it's probably worth mentioning that we see at the end of the book of John, one of the things that is predicted about him, or at least is a rumor about him, is that he would never die. I believe that was a key plot point in an Indiana Jones film, but that's not actually what it says. In fact, he seems to be addressing that rumor that's going around, and he said, no, that's not the case. But there are a couple of interesting, unique things about John. One of them being, traditionally anyway, he is the only one of the apostles that didn't die by persecution. He wasn't martyred, died of old age, it would seem. But I think another reason he's interesting is because you can see such an extreme change. You see change in just about everybody, right? You see an extreme change between Saul and then later the Apostle Paul. Of course, it's the same person, but that name change is really how we tend to place the difference. The persecutor becomes the persecuted. You see change in the Apostle Peter. He goes, there are certain aspects of his personality that tend to stick with him forever. But in some ways, I think that's a good example for us. It shows how to use these things for good. But John is probably the greatest, among the apostles, the greatest change in personality that you see. He goes from this, because him and his brother James are, later Jesus would nickname them sons of thunder because of this. They are so angry at the Samaritan village for for rejecting Jesus that they want God to call fire down from heaven to consume them. They might have been thinking about the contest between the prophet Elijah and the prophets of Baal that we saw in the Old Testament. What happens to the prophets of Baal at the end of that when it's proven that God is God and that Baal is a false god? Well, they are consumed with fire. So perhaps they were inspired by that Old Testament story. So they get this nickname, Sons of Thunder. You go from the Son of Thunder, who is John, and then by the end of his life, and you start seeing his epistles in particular, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, the love of John is just unget-overable. It is everywhere. He is such an extremely tender, loving, gentle person, completely opposite of what he is there. So there's a great example for us that this was the kind of guy he was. Christ makes him become this kind of person. Makes a big difference. Now, why do I emphasize John over James in this case? Well, it's just because John lived significantly longer than James. I said tradition tells us that John died of old age, but we don't know that for absolute sure. What we do know for sure, in fact, the only one of the apostles where we have a record, biblically speaking, of his death is James, who, in the book of Acts, we are told he is beheaded by King Herod. So he didn't get that same chance of change. But I still kind of think he probably did change quite a bit, even in his much shorter life than John did. The other thing I want to point out about here, and I mentioned this is kind of why Luke is gonna mess with our heads in trying to figure out when these things happened. This is fairly early, if you didn't notice, on to the book of Luke. We're just in chapter 9, and he's already has Jesus setting his face towards Jerusalem. And it's going to be a lot of these things, and you might look through these and like, oh, DJ actually already covered these things and put them earlier. That's because a lot of these things happen at the same time as other things that are mentioned in Matthew and Mark that are almost certainly not happening while Jesus is traveling to Jerusalem. There was, oh shoot, who was it? Mark Strauss. He made the comment that when you see Jesus saying he turns his face to Jerusalem here, not all these things are necessarily happening while Jesus is physically traveling to Jerusalem. Could be that this is more of a state of mind, that Jesus is mentally thinking about the crucifixion. At this point onward, he's starting to think about these things. So some of the things we see in the preceding chapters, or proceeding chapters, I apologize. In some of those proceeding chapters, you might be thinking, well, this probably didn't happen while Jesus was traveling there, but some of them did. Just remember, Luke is not meant, or Matthew or Mark, meant to be taken super chronologically, but Luke might be saying that all of these things are happening while Jesus is of a mindset of, my end goal right now is Jerusalem. I thought that was a good way to explain it. Okay. Let's look to another thing that Luke records for us. This time we're going into chapter 10, and I think we are back on track as far as chronology goes. I'm pretty sure he's pretty close to entering Jerusalem at this point. So Luke chapter 10, verses 38 through 42. Now as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving. And she went up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her, then, to help me. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good thing, the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. Okay. Jesus is teaching in the house of Mary and Martha. I think it's John's account that tells us that these are the sisters of Lazarus. We've already talked about the account of the rich man and Lazarus, and not that Lazarus, but this one is that Lazarus, the one who died and was raised from the dead. He's in their house, and he is teaching. Martha becomes upset with her sister Mary, because Mary is not helping with the serving. She is sitting at the feet of the Lord and listening. And it's interesting to me, because honestly, it's this kind of complaint that you can kind of see there's a bit of legitimacy to. you can almost see that this has been a fight before. You keep leaving me to do all the work, and all this work must be done. But what Jesus is teaching here, he's not telling us that it's perfectly okay, that if you're supposed to be having an equal share in work with somebody else, it's perfectly okay to leave them to do that for whatever reason. Although sometimes I think that's what people are taking from this, and that's not what you're supposed to be taking from it. What you are supposed to be taking from it is this: prioritization. I can imagine that there would have been a couple of people who would have been very upset with both Mary and Martha if Martha, instead of serving, had decided to do the exact same thing her sister was doing and sit at the Lord's feet. And then I think Jesus' condemnation would have been for those people, because this is not about serving and division of work. People are always pretty good at making sure that everybody else is pulling their part of the load, right? But that's not what this is about, because this is an extremely rare opportunity. Think about it. If you had this opportunity, what would you do, or what should you do? I'll tell you what, I wish I had the ability to sit and listen to the teachings from the Lord himself. It's a rare opportunity just to be in the presence of God, and she's doing the right thing here, because prioritization. Listen, serving the food's not an important thing right now. A lot of times it can be an important thing. Right in this particular moment, not that important of a thing. So that's why Jesus is, and I wouldn't say he's really condemning Martha here. I mean, look at the phrasing, Martha, Martha. You can practically see it, right? Even within our own culture, it's a light scolding, almost a little bit of a lecture. It just, the same way that, if your kid has forgotten to put the toothpaste away or something like that, a minor annoyance is how this is being treated. But even though it's being treated as a minor annoyance, don't think for a second it's a minor thing. Jesus is teaching her about prioritization. It's something we should keep in mind as well. We need to make sure that the prioritized things, the important things, come first. Too many Christians, they get hung up on matters of logistics or things that can be important under certain contexts, but we got to put the important things first. Just remember this: we're in the business of saving souls. That's usually what needs to come first. Okay. I'm going to try to keep today's session fairly short, so let's try to cover one more thing. Oh, something I meant to mention about that, and I'm going to break my rule twice because I didn't want to talk too much about John, but we're going to do it here again. I mentioned the famous thing about Lazarus, of course, is he's raised from the dead. Well, John's the only one of the Gospels that actually records that for us, but John doesn't record this instance where, Jesus is correcting Martha for her attitude about her sister. It's quite possible, and when you look at the timing, I think it's probable that this happened very shortly after Lazarus had been raised from the dead. Because when you look at John's account of this, it seems Jesus, and remember, they were in Bethany. That's very close to Jerusalem. It seems like he stayed there for a little bit with them. So probably after Lazarus had already been raised from the dead, Jesus stayed and taught there for a while, and that's when this particular incident happened. So there's a connection for you. Okay. Let's go to Matthew's account for this last bit. We've been talking about him journeying to Jerusalem. Now let's actually get into the journey, and we get into Jerusalem itself. Matthew chapter 21, beginning in verse 1. Now when they drew near to Jerusalem, they came to Bethphage, to the Mount of Olives. Then Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, Go into the village in front of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, you shall say, The Lord needs them, and he will send them at once. This took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, saying, Say to the daughter of Zion, Behold, your king is coming to you, humble, and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden. The disciples went in and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put them on their cloaks, and he sat on them. Most of the crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. And the crowds that went before him, that followed him, were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest!" And when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, saying, "Who is this?" And the crowd said, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee." A big feature that we have seen so far in the ministry of Christ is this choice to keep things a little bit under the radar. Right? How many times have we seen Jesus saying, after he's performed a miracle, "Don't tell anybody about this"? Or if somebody recognizes that he's the Christ, he charges them, "Don't tell anybody this yet." Well, the cards are down. And Jesus is finally showing exactly who he is. We see a lot of fulfilled prophecy over here. We have Jesus coming on a donkey, probably specifically to fulfill that prophecy that Matthew had mentioned. He goes and has his disciples go pick out a donkey. And if you're thinking to a second, that sounds a whole lot like theft, remember that Jesus does have supernatural knowledge here. My guess is that he knew that when they found this donkey, he knew that it already belonged to a disciple, which is why he tells them to say that the master has need of this and that he would let them go. Now, it doesn't tell us that's exactly what happened, but I imagine that probably is what happened after receiving those instructions. And the person in question whoever owned the donkey recognized, okay, I'm getting the donkey back, and, it's for a pretty important purpose. There's probably some symbolism in the fact that it was a donkey. Donkeys were sort of the luxury beast to ride on. I know we don't do a lot of beast riding today, and when we do, it's usually for pleasure, and it's usually going to be a horse. But if you really talk to people who do a lot of this sort of thing, what you find out is that for a lot of them, they actually prefer to ride mules, mule skinners, right? Half horse, half donkey. And one of the big reasons is because of the gentle gait that a mule has. If you have to be on a horse for a long time, it can really, it can start to mess with you. I know Brooke and I, we went horseback riding for fun a couple years ago. And I gotta tell you, it was like an hour and a half ride. And when we got back, man, I thought I was gonna die. My knees were hurting so bad as soon as I got off that horse. I told that to a horse riding friend of mine, and she was pretty sure I must have been doing something kind of screwy in order for my knees to be hurting that much. But even so, it wasn't, it's not a Lincoln Town car. It's not gonna be the most comfortable ride in the world, right? Donkeys, on the other hand, are a much more comfortable ride. So why don't you just ride donkeys around everywhere? Because they're not particularly good for war. They're not that aggressive of an animal. They're much smaller than horses, right? So there was sort of symbology going on here. Somebody coming, a king coming in on a horse meant he was here to conquer. It meant violence and death. King coming in on a donkey means, hey, I'm just going for the comfort here. This is peace. And so the symbol here could be Jesus is coming as a peaceful king coming into Jerusalem, which, of course, being the capital city of Israel, there's a little bit of symbolism there too, right? But here comes the king. We have heard so much. Think about how much time we have heard about the king, and it's just not really been playing out. We see the visit of the wise men wanting to see the king of the Jews, and then he instead flees because of the wrath of Herod, of course. And when people figure out that this is the anointed one, the Messiah, the king, he tells them to keep it to himself. And when people want to make him a king, he will get away from them. Here we finally have the coronation. Here we finally see Jesus being king over the Jews, but he's not going to take it by force. That's why you got the donkey. He's going to be king over the Jews, but only those Jews who decide to willingly follow him. And it won't just be for the Jews first, But soon the Samaritans and then the entire world will have their king. And one of the things that strikes me as odd here is going to be the extreme difference, because it just cannot be the case look how this is described. Look how many people are here who are putting down their garments, who are putting down palm leaves, another symbol of peace, in front of Jesus to recognize him, saying, Hosanna, here is the Christ. It cannot be the case that none of them were present later on when they're going to be saying something very, very different. Shows you how fickle people are, I suppose. There's a train for you. Well, we're not going to quite get to the gigantic change of heart, but we are going to start seeing how that process happens next week. So, until then, I love you all, and I hope you have a wonderful day.